Hi, this is the show that answers the questions that expats, nomads, and full-time travelers living across the globe ask themselves every day. These insights and secrets are shared when we interview experts and authors from across the globe. Hello, everyone. Doreen here. It is my pleasure today to introduce you to Sylvia Thiesen. Hi, Sylvia. How are you today?
Hi, Doreen. I'm great. I'm super excited to be here and have our conversation.
Yes. So where are you currently, please?
Good question. Currently, I'm at home in Colorado, and after decades of living in Denver, I more recently moved up to the mountains. So I'm in a little town called Basalt.
How fun. And that's lovely. It's beautiful up there near Aspen, and
Yeah.
you have all those facilities. So tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of how distance and travel has been a part of your life, really in different phases of your life. Can you talk to us a little bit about that so that we listeners can have some context as to who you are and your relationship with travel?
Absolutely. Well, it goes all the way back to being a teeny kid because my mother was 100% born and raised Italian. And my dad was a good Midwestern boy. And we grew up in this little college town where they were both professors. But because of my mom's heritage with being in Italy, we traveled a lot. And a couple years when I was in as early as elementary school, we went back and lived in Rome for a couple years. And later in high school, they moved us all to England when they had a sabbatical. So I grew up in a family where my parents really role modeled, I would say, the ease of travel. They had 9 kids.
Oh
And
my.
that was back in the day when you dressed up to get on a plane, right? Kind of the Pan Am days. I'm dating.
Yes, the
Yeah,
gloves and the hat.
yeah, so we would get dressed up and put on our little velvet dresses and go travel. But I had the good fortune of growing up in a family that traveled.
That's amazing. So you actually were a TCK for a couple of years, which is a third culture kid, a kid that grows up outside their parents' culture, right?
Yes. And what was interesting, and I don't know how common it was at the time, but when I was 8 and 9 years old living in Rome, I was fluent as a little kid can be in Italian.
Yes.
That era, when we got back to the States, even though my mom was a linguist, she spoke a lot of languages. She said, okay, that's the end of Italian. We're just going to speak English now. So it was an interesting time where it was like we had all those experiences. But once back in the States, my mom wanted us to assimilate and be, quote, mainstream.
Interesting. So that speaks volumes about the invisible journey of a migrant parent, right?
Right.
Did you ever talk to her about that decision?
Yeah, she and my dad fought about it for years of why she didn't keep Italian up with the kids. But, we lived in a little college town in very rural Minnesota. And I think she was protecting us in that we already stuck out. Nobody was traveling internationally. And I think she just didn't want us to be too far from the norm.
Yes, yes.
And so speaking Italian was just going to set us apart even more so. And I think she did it with good intentions, but
It was probably good to be cohesive and feel like you were part of the community. So that was her intention. Interesting.
yeah.
So you just returned from working remotely for 4 months, and you were in Charleston, Mexico, and Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
I've never been to Puerto Rico. That sounds like fun. And you noticed a little bit of a change in who you were being. And I would really love to dig into that. Tell us about that experience of your last winter and how that has sort of given you some insight.
Oh, yeah, that's a fun topic. So after growing up in Minnesota and living in Colorado my whole adult life, around 60, I realized I really don't need this much winter. So my impetus to leave this past winter was the first time I had the freedom to be 100% remote with my work. And I'd never been to Charleston. I didn't want to travel internationally because of the time difference, because I have coaching clients all day and I didn't want to be in Europe or somewhere where I had to be up late at night.
Yes.
So that really limited my choices of where to go. But with Charleston, my criteria was I wanted to be somewhere where I didn't know anybody, where
Mm-hmm.
it was relatively warm.
Mm-hmm.
I could stick my toes in the sand and walk on the beach, and that had some history and culture. And so I just chose Charleston really randomly, but it ended up being a great experience. And yeah, I think you and I talked about how I really realized when I get out of my routine how different I am. I was so much friendlier and chattier with people, talking to strangers. Whereas I
Yes.
feel like at home, I'm so task oriented and in my little bubble that it's easy to not notice the opportunities around me.
I think you would like coming to San Miguel because San Miguel is the kind of place where people make friends very quickly. It has
Ah,
quite the reputation for fast falling in love of people and friends and creation of communities because people are chatty.
oh, I love that. Yeah, Charleston, I mean, you can imagine the South. It was very friendly. And they have the college, the law school, and the med school downtown. And so it's very youthful and a lot of diversity with age and very vibrant. And I loved that about it. And of course, there's a ton of
Yes.
history. So
Yeah. So you said that you are more friendly and you were talking to strangers. So tell me about, do you have a perspective on using travel as a tool for personal growth? Because I know you've been in the mental health and the psychotherapy and the therapeutic world for a long time, and you've served your time in all of those arenas and including the corporate arena.
yeah.
So, do you have a perspective on how we can use our travel as a tool for liberation or personal growth?
I do. I think there's so many tools we can use. And I think travel is a great one if we choose to be intentional about it, right? So,
Yes.
an example that we just talked about with me in Charleston is I was observing myself and realizing, oh, you are being different because you're out of your environment, which opened up choices to like, do I want to take that experience home with me and expand my life in that way? And, travel, no matter how well planned, there is going to be things that are out of our control, right? If
Oh,
you
yes.
if you want some uncertainty, I think travel is a great way to do that. And I heard recently someone saying that they believed that flexibility is
Mhm.
one of the top signs of healthy mental state. Like if you're mentally healthy, you have high flexibility. I think travel requires that we're flexible. I think that people who don't enjoy travel or who end up coming home with a lot of negative experiences is because they were too rigid in their mindset, weren't willing to go with the flow or to be open to what the opportunities were. And so I think travel just puts all of that on steroids for us.
It does. And living overseas for long periods of times does that also. So the first person I interviewed for this podcast was a woman who does intercultural training for people who are preparing to move overseas.
Hmm.
And it was so interesting to listen to her perspective of how she would sort of leave a training shaking her head and going, I don't know if they're going to make it
I,
because the mindset was very closed.
Yeah, and I think the thing that brings up is sometimes on the flip side of the coin, sometimes people can have too much expectation for travel. Like you and I were talking before we hopped on about how wherever you go, there you are. And
Yes.
sometimes I think people are in this mindset where they believe that travel or relocating is going to totally solve all their problems, going to figure out their marriage, or they're going to get out of a depression or whatever. And I think we can put too high of expectations on travel because ultimately, some of it is mindset and expectations, but I don't think either you or I believe that geographics are a 100% cure.
I would agree with that. I certainly have never seen geography cure mental health.
Yeah.
Although a change of environment can definitely change a frequency in a person.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think maybe it's the balance of like set off on the adventure with some realistic expectations and an open mind, but hold like needing to have particular outcomes to hold that kind of lightly.
Sure. And I think that not only holding it lightly, but also at the same time using your imagination as to stretching it. So
Mhm.
what's possible here? And, what if you could? That when I was coaching about 10 years ago, the phrase, what if you could? So what if you could? I think that it's a combination of using all of those little pieces that helps us become different, right?
Absolutely. And don't you find with travel, Doreen, like I just think being in a different environment, I feel so much more imaginative, so much more creative. Traveling, I always feel like there's no obstacles and I'm full of ideas. And then when I get home to my normal routine, everything starts seeming less realistic. But just by the nature of travel and being out of your environment, I think expands our sense of possibility.
So I have some theories about that. I don't know if they're correct or not, but when you go somewhere new and you've never been there before, your eyeballs and your eyes are stimulated,
Mm,
and your hearing is stimulated, and your taste sense is stimulated, and the sense of the air on your skin, or the wind, or the nature in its own right has proven to be a very, very balancing effect on people. So, is it possible that having our senses stimulated relates to being more intuitive and more thoughtful and more imaginative and having more fun?
I love that theory. I've never heard it said that way, but let's go with that. I like that. I think there's a book in there, Doreen.
I'd rather be podcast host.
Yeah, I mean, I think all joking aside, I think the opposite is also true that familiarity, what do they say? Familiarity breeds contempt or familiarity puts us to sleep. I think being too comfortable seeing the same thing, experiencing the same things can lull us into feeling very flat. And
I
as
would
you said,
agree.
the opposite is true. When you're having all this stimulation on your senses, you
Mm.
wake up again. You wake up to all these possibilities.
Exactly. And just think what, by following that, just think what our listeners could possibly wake up to. I mean, isn't this just, aren't we talking here just about the essence of transformation or transitions right here in this space?
Yeah, and I think you use the word transitions, which I think is interesting because a lot of your listeners have either already moved to other countries or are thinking about it or in transition. And did you ever read this book? It always stood out in my mind. It was a little small classic paperback called Transitions by William Bridges.
Oh, yes. We quoted a lot in the
Yeah,
expat field.
yeah, and he talks about that neutral zone, right? That
Yeah.
most of us think you have an ending, leaving home or whatever it is, and then a beginning, the new adventure. But what we miss is that opportunity for the neutral zone where we're less attached to the old, we're less attached to our old environment, and we
Yes.
feel sort of untethered. And it's
Yes.
very uncomfortable hanging out in that neutral zone, but it's required to get to the new beginning. I think
Exactly.
that's true with travel and adventure too. It's not just you leave one place and start at another. There's that transition in the neutral zone.
And you have to bring all our invisible parts with us, right? Because we don't just have a body and belongings that move. We have memories, imagination, perspectives, all of those imaginary things, which I talk about them as you pack them in another suitcase.
I love it.
And you got to unpack that suitcase. That's the problem. None of us ever go, oh, I think I'll go unpack my imagination today.
Right.
Do we? Or am I just unusual? Right.
No, even though you brought it with you, yeah, you forget it's there.
Exactly, exactly. And we all have that opportunity. So, where would you put travel and adventuring or moving to another country in terms of a comparison with methods for self-help and personal development?
Yeah, I mean, there's such a continuum there. And I think so much of it depends on the person because you can travel and be an adventure and never have a transformation. If
So
your
true.
mindset is super rigid and you're stuck in your ways and you're not going to like anything, I have a acquaintance who does travel, and every time she comes back, she's very disappointed about what went wrong and wasn't the way she thought it was. And I'm always kind of impressed with how, despite all these adventures and opportunities, she chooses to not have any transformation. And on
Yeah.
the other side, if you go into travel as a tool for self growth and personal awareness, anything traveling to the town next to you, it doesn't even have to be international or something big, could change you, could open up your mind, could expand your mindset. And so I think it's just kind of, there's people who travel and are changed by it, and part of that is personality, I think.
Interesting. Interesting. So it opens us up to enjoy things. Does it also bring us more present? I've always felt like it brought me more present. I had to pay greater attention to what was happening around me.
Mm-hmm.
And at the age of 22, I was a junior diplomat in West Africa. And it's interesting that now can recall as I age, I can now recall that better than just a decade or two afterwards.
Oh, interesting. And would you
Yes.
say it's because you had to be so present and aware?
Yeah, well, partly. I think that we have these experiences in travel that kind of iron impressions into our soul. And sometimes it's not until you really sit back and have time and reflect on our lives that we can distill that down to something that means something. So it's almost like a way that as a, let's say, a serial expat, it's been a way that I have discovered to unpack my own self-development and growth is by reflecting. And when I reflect back even further now, remembering and I'm putting together is making more sense than it did in the moment.
Mm. Have you used journaling? Do you journal much when you travel?
Yeah, I have. I have not been a consistent journaler. But the podcast is called Nomadic Diaries for a reason because I just go in and I'll write a diary one day and then later.
And it's always fascinating to read back. I was going through some old boxes and came across some diaries from traveling as a teenager, and you forget how
Yes.
impactful some of it was.
Yeah, exactly. So, how important is intentionality when you brought up the subject of being intentional? Talk to me about how do you build intention?
What a great question. I mean, doesn't it start with kind of being aware of what your desire is, I think.
Mm,
Someone choosing a big move or who has already done a big move, I think choosing what was the desire? Was there a goal? What was the
yeah.
motivation?
Mm,
And starting with what your hopes and desires are. And
mm,
then being intentional. So if I know my desire is I want to be more self aware, I want to have adventure, I want to be out of my comfort zone, whatever it is, being clear on that will guide my intentions, right? Well, if I want it to be uncomfortable and then I find myself at a train station at night and miss the last train, well, I want it to be out of my comfort zone. Like I can make an intentional choice that what can I learn from this? What could the opportunity be?
yes, yes.
Opposed to just reverting to, oh crap, like everything's going wrong and, blah, blah, blah. So I think being clear on what everybody's got a different reason for traveling.
Yes, I interviewed a lady the other day who celebrated her seventh birthday on the Camino and her 70th birthday on the Camino. And she'd taken care of her husband for 18 years before he passed away. And then she'd never done anything really by herself or on her own. She had 5 kids, and that was very
Huh.
helpful. But she went by herself and it was a great interview because I thought, now that's a huge amount of intention that built up over years and years and decades.
That's incredible and good for her for not using like age or being solo or whatever as a reason not to do it.
Yeah, isn't that an amazing story?
I love that. Yeah, and when you talk about intention, I think it can be different with every adventure too. Like you mentioned when we got started today that I'd gone to Mexico this winter, which I did, but I went with my younger sister, and usually we do adventure travel. We've been to Cuba, we've been to South Africa. We usually like to do something that's kind of more edgy.
Yes.
And as we were talking about our sister's trip together, we were planning Colombia. And when we really got clear on what our desire was, we really weren't up for an adventure for different reasons. She was wrapping up a job and I'd been very busy. And when we really got clear on what is our desire, we really just wanted to sit on a beach, have nothing that we needed to go explore, very unlike us, and have margaritas and guacamole on the beach and go home really rested. And once we got clear on that, we ditched a lot of plans and just picked a quick trip to Mexico, nothing adventurous, had great dinners, got massaged, had sister time. Was it the most memorable, adventurous, wow? No. But it was intentional to just relax and sit still. And that's what we needed. So I think it can change. It's not like our intentions or our desires are always the same.
Well, I believe that that's also true about yes, about our desires and everything change. I mean, everything is constantly changing, whether we're aware of it or not, right?
Mhm.
So you talk to women and you help women become more bold and make these sorts of decisions. And the idea of moving and living overseas is a very bold choice, especially if you are a solo, single female.
Yes. Yes.
So, what would you say to those women about how can they become more confident, more bold within themselves?
Yeah. So are you thinking of the woman who has not yet moved to a different country or?
Yes, I think so. I mean, many people have gone and visited and touristed and
Right.
been maybe been a short-term traveler. But I think when you make, and I actually have an old colleague of ours in common who is a member of the National Speakers Association in Colorado, who has recently sold her apartment and moved to Portugal
Mhm.
permanently.
That's a hot spot right now, isn't it? I
It
mean,
is.
your question about how to move into that boldness, I think we tend to hear, big stories, big successes, and kind of the dramatics in life. But I'm a believer in like set ourselves up for success. And
Yes.
so for some of my coaching clients, women who want to do something big, but maybe they've been stuck for a lot of years, they don't feel like they've ever done anything really bold. I always think let's like start building that muscle. Like you wouldn't go to the gym and pick up 100-pound weight. And one of
Right.
the exercises I love to give that women come back and just say was super powerful was like, if you are thinking about doing something bold, let's say moving to another country, but you haven't been living boldly, one simple exercise is for women to go out to a restaurant by themselves, sit at a table, not at the bar, not
Yes.
have their phone on, and just experience how uncomfortable it feels to be sitting, having a nice dinner by yourself without being distracted by your phone. And women come back and say, oh my gosh, like I felt like everybody was looking at me. I felt so uncomfortable. I felt like people were wondering, why is she by herself in the evening? Does she not have friends? Like all this stuff comes up.
Yes.
And then you can congratulate yourself on, like, okay, that sounds really minor, but if you're not used to being out in the world by yourself, that can be one small step towards building the confidence and the skills and the muscle to do something bold like relocating internationally. Yeah, I don't think you have to always start with, I'm going to do something big and crazy. It's like just start being bold in your life.
Right. So that really speaks to a little bit of getting out of your comfort zone because as I would feel really uncomfortable going downtown, and sometimes I do go downtown and have a meal by myself, but I'm always accompanied by my phone.
Yes. It's funny. I did a post on it on LinkedIn recently talking about the issue of eating solo and describing a recent experience I had. And I think it was the post that I got the most engagement ever because people had a lot of feelings about it.
Absolutely. A lot came up, I'm sure.
Yes. How uncomfortable it can be. And also people saying they didn't think that was a good idea to be without your phone. And like it was just a fascinating conversation.
Yes.
And I think those small things can really build our confidence that we are adventurers and we can
Yes.
start being adventurers in our hometown too.
Yeah. And we can also start being adventurers in our own lives in a small way. I mean,
Right.
I always tell people, if you want to become an adventurer, you don't have to, you don't have to move to Cameroon or do something like that. You just take a step out of your comfort zone. Even that adventurous. For some of us,
It could be just start taking a different way home or shop
yeah,
somewhere different or hang out with different people and start feeling what's it like to not do my typical thing. And as
yeah.
you talked about earlier, start waking up all those senses, start stimulating all those senses that have been asleep.
Right, right. And make yourself uncomfortable. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you asked me earlier if I loved living in San Miguel. And yes, I do enjoy living in San Miguel very much, but I don't depend on San Miguel, the city and the people in it to make me entirely happy. I think that, I have really strong feelings about being uncomfortable sometimes because I see that that's where the growth sometimes happens. Is that true, or is that just a made up thing that we have all been sold into? Oh yes, get uncomfortable and you'll feel better or you'll grow. I mean, sometimes I wonder about the bubble that goes around quotations like this that are partly proven by science, and sometimes you just wonder if they're in the zeitgeist of the West right now.
Yeah. Oh, that is fascinating. I mean, I think there are people. I think about my dad, who I recently lost, and it was just before his 100th birthday. Amazing man, a retired professor, a really voracious reader. And I think about his temperament. Yes, he traveled the world. He moved, as you heard, moved us as kids to different
Yes.
countries. But he had one of those temperaments where he was going to be content whether,
Mm,
at the end, he was alone in a small assisted living apartment. He had that same level of contentment
mm,
and enjoying life, whether he was riding, camels in the desert or he was sitting in a teeny apartment in assisted living. It was just his constitution. Other people have the personality where, like, they need a lot of change and adventure and stimulation to
yeah,
feel like they're generating those happy vibes. And I think
interesting.
you had a beautiful way of saying, like, you're somewhere in the middle. Like, you love to travel, you love new experiences, but you don't depend on them for your internal happiness.
I think that all of us are different. And listener, if you are considering moving overseas or making a great leap, that it would be really worthwhile checking in with Sylvia because she has some really great stories here. And I like that exercise. And I bet there are more of those.
Oh, I've got hundreds of them.
That,
What I do all day, every day. But you're talking about the comfort zone. And I think, yeah, it is interesting whether we've just been sold a bill of goods. But I think everything we're talking about leads me to believe that it's much harder to grow if you don't get out of your comfort zone. I
yeah,
mean, I've had
yeah,
some crazy, unexpected life events, everything from being widowed young to, oh, just all kinds of things. And when I look back on it, yeah, it would have been maybe fun to have a really smooth life where everything went according to plan. But I also feel like my big life growth, my pivotal changes came out of like chaos or pain or
yeah.
grief. So I tend to think we do need, I mean, I'm all for learning those things by getting out of your comfort zone through joy and ease. It doesn't need to be tragedy. Let's take the ease and joy route. But I do think there's something about being out of your comfort zone that creates growth more quickly and more easily than when you're stuck in a rut.
Maybe what travel does is it just sort of oils the wheels of that so that that
Mhm.
can happen and be facilitated a bit easier. If you we're talking to someone who was considering travel, and someone pointed out something very important to me recently that, in the United States, vacations were always, and still to this day, in many of the big corporations that a lot of our millennials and Gen Z and Gen Xers are living in, only get 2 weeks of vacation a year. And this was a person from New Zealand whose philosophy was it's really one of the reasons why people are just bursting at the seams to travel from America right now is because the system they up in did not offer a month or three every year to go travel. That's
Yeah,
something to think about, isn't it?
It is. And right now, the trend where companies were offering unlimited paid time off.
Yes, PTO.
Yeah. And I was talking to my nephew who's 23. He lives in Manhattan. He's a recent college graduate, kind of in the first couple years of his working career. And he is able to work remotely and was offered, his company believes in the unlimited paid time off. But fascinating, he said nobody's taking vacations because there's no parameters on what is okay. He said it's kind of created this a little bit of almost paranoia of like, well, I don't want to take vacation or take more vacation than my boss. And there's all this like hesitancy. So I
Yeah.
do think as a culture, Americans, we haven't figured out what is a good balance of if you're in a traditional job, what's a good balance of being given vacation time and not?
Yes, I know that I'm from Europe originally. Of course, you know
Right.
that. And so I'm always sort of surprised. 2 weeks a year? Well, when do you get your vacation? But when is your summer holiday? That's just something else. What is your summer holiday? And where we were so fortunate to work overseas for several years in Japan and then, a decade and a half in Saudi Arabia, where you get 6 weeks for repatriation. And I think that repatriation in that sense is very much like rehabilitation or renewal or repurposing or anything you
Right.
would do with a human that would be different, right? You can't do it in 2 weeks.
No, it ties into what we were saying about the neutral zone. You don't just go from one move to another with no transition or like being able to breathe and relax and have plenty of time. And yeah, I think that's definitely one place our country falls short is the is the vacation. I'm sure New Zealanders and the Kiwis and the Australians all that look at us like, what? Yeah, 2 weeks is nothing.
Exactly. So, what advice would you give someone who's considering they've worked all their lives? And let's pretend this person has, just had a couple of weeks vacation most years. Maybe they eventually worked up to a month. But now that they're like, oh, there's a world out there. And they're the luckiest people in the world, I think, because now people have more freedom. Can you talk to me about using travel as a pathway to feeling that freedom or experiencing it?
Yeah, I mean, these are just my obviously personal opinions, but I think the person you're describing who's had, limited vacations over the years and now has this freedom, I think depending on age, I mean, I'm 64 and I have a sense that like any big adventures I want to do, this is a good time to do them over the next decade or two because we don't know, like, whether doing something very physical or daunting is still going to sound appealing in 10 years. I think
Exactly.
it's like, what are some things that you really want to experience that you have the health and the energy and the resources to do right now? Start there. And the other thing that comes to mind is I think we all get in a rut with the kinds of travel that we do. Or you're someone who loves the adventure, or you've done the all inclusive, or you've been into cruises, or whatever your thing is. I think just deviating from that.
Yes.
Look
Yeah.
at what you've always done for travel over the years and what
Mhm.
would be something very different be a stretch. That would be a comfort zone. The trip I described with my sister, it was the reverse of that. Like we didn't want to do adventure that time. But I think just, switching it up a little bit and not doing the same old thing.
That's great advice, particularly for people who've had some experience of traveling a bit every year.
Right.
Yeah.
It's easy to kind of get into it like this is how we travel.
Yes. And so that speaks to mindset approaches, doesn't it? That speaks to how we need to adapt. What other things do we need to be thinking about in terms of growing our mindset? There's a lot of talk about mindset, and the mindset is really
Yeah.
a collection of different things. Can you give us a better definition of what you believe it to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think mindset as it relates to travel and relocation and everything we're talking about, I think curiosity is high on the list.
Mhm.
And having a mindset of curiosity opens us up to things that we can not be in judgment about. Curious about, well, why do they do it this way? Or why are we waiting a half hour for the waiter to show up? Or why are the planes never leaving when they say they are? Whatever it is, I think just coming from a mindset of curiosity opens us up to learning instead of complaining.
Yes.
And there's so much talk now about the growth mindset, which has been overused. But again, I think it goes back to coming from a place of flexibility rather
Mm,
than going into an adventure thinking you know how it's supposed to be or you know all
yeah.
that. It's going into it knowing like we know some of what's going to happen, but we don't know all of it. And like, let's stay nimble. Let's roll with the punches. Let's see what's coming down the pike in
Yeah.
sort of a playful way. Sitting in a coffee shop the other day, and I heard these two women next to me. I love to eavesdrop on conversations when I'm by myself. But one woman had just gotten back from Italy, and the other one asked her how her travel was. And she proceeded to just give this litany of everything that had gone wrong, down to that the person behind her in the plane was kicking her in the back, which is annoying. But I thought, wow, that's so interesting because her mindset was this is the way it was supposed to go. And
Ah,
here are all the things that didn't happen. And I think that's all in our head. If you just go into it with curiosity and
yeah.
flexibility, your
Yeah.
your mind, that reticular activator, the part of your brain that looks for what you're looking for, is going to look for where are the opportunities? Where is the growth? What could I learn about
Yes.
myself?
Yeah.
As opposed to like, everything went wrong. So, yeah, I think curiosity,
Interesting.
flexibility, and I would add one last one on mindset. I would say celebration. I think travel and relocation and adventure, it's such a great time to celebrate. So, for the person who's never done a big trip, like celebrate the boldness and the braveness and the courage of going.
Yeah.
Celebrate like all the things that are new. Celebrate trying raw fish for the first time or whatever it is. And looking for reasons to congratulate yourself and be celebratory. Because it's easy to be a little self conscious, right? Of like, I'm not a good traveler or I didn't respond well to this. And it's like, oh, talk to yourself like you would a friend. Like, good for you. Look at you.
Yeah.
Look what
Yeah.
you're doing. That's amazing.
Yeah. So we talked about a growth mindset, a mindset of curiosity, and you talked about the mindset of celebration. My daughter and I, every 10 years when I have a big birthday, we do something that is supposedly scares me, but this one wasn't very scary. We just did some parasailing on the beach in
Oh,
Mexico.
I think
Yeah,
that counts as scary, Doreen.
does it? I was like, well, this is nothing.
But that's where that celebratory mindset comes in. You could be like, look at me, I'm a badass.
It just surprised me. I expected it to be like more of a big deal. And it was
Well,
like,
because you've done scary things, right? So you
yeah,
flex
yeah.
that muscle a lot, and your tolerance for what's considered scary is going to be
Mm,
very different from
mm.
someone who hasn't had the opportunity or done much out of their comfort zone, where that could have been terrifying. What are some of the things you did on your other birthdays? Like, was there something that was super scary for you?
Well, the most scary was I rappelled down a 300-foot building, actually the Four Seasons Hotel in Houston, for my 60th birthday with my daughter and my husband. And that was more scary because, if there was an accident, I was the one, not an accident, but if it locked up, I was the one that had to figure it all out. So I went down extremely easily and effectively. And it was the most mindful experience of my life because I knew if the equipment locked up, that I would have to be even more calm. And
Oh,
that was a stretch.
but wait, was the Four Seasons doing this as an activity?
No, there's an organization called Over the Edge, and they raise funds for charities. And they
Oh,
set up these events in I don't know if they're still around, but they used to set them up in all the major cities in the US. And they would take all the rappelling equipment and the gear, and they'd set up like 3 or 4 stations on a building with their permission, obviously, and their blessing. And they would train you in how to rappel.
oh my
You
gosh.
might want to try this.
I know. I
Write
just
that down, Over the Edge.
well, I'm researching because I love doing that for birthdays, and I'm researching. What I came up with for this year was I might do trapeze lessons, which scares me to death because I don't like the idea of like letting go.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
And I've looked at people of all ages who are doing it, and it looks amazing. So I love that.
I was hoping we would do that in Mexico, but the facility that we went to, the was canceled.
Would
And
that
it's not.
scare you, do you think?
Oh yes. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
That would definitely scare me.
Me too.
But going rappelling 300 feet was a big deal. How do you suggest we integrate? So if we make these bold moves, we demonstrate curiosity, and then we go out and we take some action and we have a little bit of success and we celebrate that success. So we are basically shoring up the muscle, or we're growing that muscle of adventure. How do you suggest we integrate all of that when we return from our travel? Or I'm thinking about expats who move from home from overseas. How do we integrate this, and how do we bottle the lessons in a way that we can use
Mm.
them?
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is our identity. So when someone comes back, having lived in another country, the identity is that you're an adventurer, right? And to
Mhm.
come home and keep living in the identity of the adventurer. So that could look like a lot of things. I think when you have lived in other countries, when you have been a traveler, one way to keep that going, I think, is to be open and look for opportunities to connect with travelers. So you meet someone here who doesn't speak English and they've never been to your town or whatever, is like, to give them the graciousness of how were you treated? How did you like to be treated when you were in foreign countries? And to extend that same graciousness to people you meet,
Yes.
because you're living in the identity of I'm an adventurer. I'm not a closed-minded person who's just going to pass them up. And then, like we talked about, I mean, you could be in that spirit of adventure and open-mindedness and personal growth in the little things. So I think when you come home, there's all that re-entry, all the challenges that come with re-entry, but you're also a changed person. You're more expanded, you're more open,
Yes.
or creative, and to keep
Yes.
it going in little ways. So maybe it's signing up for a painting class, or, taking an afternoon and go do photography in your hometown and look at it through the eyes of a tourist or a traveler. And keeping that spirit going, I think, can be a lot of things.
Well, those are great ideas that you've given us. So tell us about how it is that you are now helping women. You have moved through this illustrious career of many, many phases in your life. You were a speaker, professional speaker. You've been coaching. How is it that you support people? What would that look like if you were to support someone who was going off on, they've got this inkling of adventure and they're like, but I have no clue how to do it. How would you support them in that?
Well, I think they could go do it without any preparation, throw caution to the wind and let the chips fall where they may.
Yes.
Or the coaching process is really a process of self-discovery. And so just as a person would be planning their trip, their itinerary, their flights, their lodging, I think you can also train your thinking. And by coaching, typically women come to me when they've had an amazing life, they've had the career, they've done travel, whatever it is, and they hit a place where they feel out of juice, they feel flat, saying, I just don't see what's ahead for me. Like, I have nothing to complain about, my life is good, but I just don't see what the next decades look like. And we go through a process of creating that chapter. So for someone who's thinking about moving to another country and relocating, it could be using coaching to start looking at what are your thought patterns about that? What are your intentions? What's your wildest dream of what could happen by this adventure? And
Yes.
starting to plant those seeds and
Yes.
practicing some of those behaviors so
Mm.
that you're prepared and have a transition to the big adventure of actually doing the move.
Interesting. Well, that sounds very pragmatic and engaging for most people. What sort of, just across the board, what is the greatest experience that they have once they've gone through this kind of coaching?
You know what? People say that it changed their life, but what I would say is it changed their thinking. So, my job
Yeah.
as a coach is to disrupt your thinking, is to get in your head and shake things up. So, I'm not concerned about whether people like me or whether they get angry or whether they start crying or whatever it is. That's my job, is to make them
Yeah.
uncomfortable. By being uncomfortable in the coaching session, obviously there's a ripple effect, right?
Yeah. It shakes everything up.
It does. And so I would think people feel like they can't go back to seeing it the way it was. Remember those old classic optical illusions where they're like black and white, there's the elderly lady.
Yes.
You look one way, and then if you look the
Yeah.
other way, there's a vase. And once you
Yes.
see the vase, you can't
Yes.
go back to just seeing the elderly woman. I feel
Right.
like it's like that.
It
Like
is.
once you're
Yeah.
opened up to thinking and seeing and experiencing life differently, you can't shrink back to the way it was.
Yes.
Coaching's an amazing avenue to do that.
I would love to ask you in closing 3 fun questions. Number 1 is a desert island dish. If you were banished to a desert island on one of these adventures that you go on, and you could only take one dish from your local space in Colorado that you're living now, what would that be?
Oh, that's pretty easy for me because Colorado, the one dish is a lot of Tex-Mex. There's a lot of fish tacos, chicken enchiladas, all of that.
Yeah,
I love that.
one of
So
those.
one dish on a deserted island would probably be like the ingredients for chicken enchiladas. I could eat that every day and not get tired of it.
You do need to come visit.
I would love to.
That's excellent. So, second question is, what would be the superpower that you would recommend people focus on if they're going to take a big leap in their lives and move into travel or overseas lifestyles?
Ooh, the one superpower that comes to mind is the ability to see everything as an opportunity.
Oh, wow.
So, like, you would just go and it's like you have these glasses on and you can't see obstacles. All you see is opportunities. That would be an amazing superpower for travel.
That would be fabulous. I love that. That's fabulous. And thirdly, you've been out there in the world. You've been several places all winter. You've been gone. Can you please tell us, what do you think the world needs right now? What do we as humans need right now?
What a beautiful question. It may sound corny, but I think what we need is just kindness.
I don't think there's any corny in kindness.
Yeah, I think just kindness. I'm really touched when I was traveling and away from home. Like a little act of kindness can completely change the day. I had an Uber driver when I got back to Denver who I thought about for weeks. A few minutes of kindness, a few minutes of like genuine engaging, like really impacted me.
Wonderful. That's great.
I love your questions.
Well, this has been so impactful. I hope listeners that you can remember this broadcast, listen to it and share it and like and review it, please. But finally, in closing, how can our listeners find you and connect with you?
Oh, thank you, Doreen. Right now, the easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn, where I have some great conversations and tips and tools. My last name looks like Thiesen. I'm sure it'll be in the notes. And the other place is if you're on Instagram, I do a lot of tips and free resources, and you'll get a sense of who I am and maybe get some good ideas of which of those tools you could use.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us
so
today.
fun. And now be careful because you've invited me to San Miguel. Be careful what you say there. You might just hear back from me saying, when can I come?
No problem.
Great to see you.
Thank you so much.